What's up, everybody? It's Jimmy back at you with another episode of Combat and Cryptids. You know what I mean? Pimp the new sign. Shit, I can't do this. Pimp the new sign that I had made up. Well, not made up. Me and uh, me and a buddy at work made this thing. Actually, it's pretty sweet. We just made it out of some steel that we had laying around, and we had this little plasma cutter. And basically, he free-handed the whole thing, and then I just kind of cut it out with the plasma cutter. So I think it turned out pretty good. The lettering's a little messed up, but as far as with the first one, it's kind of it's there. It's nice. So we'll stick with that for now until we make some money, and then we can make our own thing. But for now, that's what we'll stick with. So again, what's up, everybody? Obviously today we're gonna be jumping into like some weirder subjects and stuff. So I think we're over our personal experiences as far as encounters for us, as far as like cryptid encounters and stuff like that. That's pretty much what I've stated in these last couple episodes is basically everything that I have partaken or either done some sort of either I've seen it or I've been around it, like that kind of scenario. But it's just something that now we're just going to try and see how we can segue this whole scenario and this whole topic and just kind of see where it goes. But I just want to give a shout out real quick. So today is November 10th, which is, if you don't know, I'm about to tell you right now, is the Marine Corps birthday. Boom, 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 boom. No, I'm just kidding. But no, it is the Marine Corps birthday today. So, in honor of that, here's to all my buddies that we've served with and stuff like that. So, here's to a great birthday, guys, for you guys out there. But yeah, I just thought I had to get that out of the way. You know what I mean? Because tomorrow's Veterans Day, but always like this is like the week where your liver takes like the worst toll. Your liver takes a toll to where it's like it looks like this guy back here, right here, little skeleton guy. You know what I mean? That's what it kind of looks like. And basically, in this week, I always have it's always a big week. Like this whole week, the whole first week and a half of November is always like the best week because I had my wife's birthday, so Angel, she just turned 33, and then shortly after that, you have the Marine Corps birthday, and then the next day after that, you have Veterans Day. So it's like the best of everything you could want is like all in one. So which is pretty cool. It's pretty sweet. So I mean, this week is always pretty good. So I was very excited to come on and kind of share and talk about these things today. But got a little more extra pep in your step. You know what I mean? So it's always a good thing. So this episode is really truly like I'm happy with it and stuff like that. Regardless of what the outcome of like, hey, like these are the things that I want to talk about. Regardless of that, this is just fun for me. It's not really it's not like some episodes I'm like, oh man, I don't really want to talk about these things and stuff. Which I have more like combat stories and stuff like that, which we'll go over in later episodes. But for this one, it's just really how I kind of want to segue this whole, the cryptid side of it and everything like that. And I just want to, like, after I'm done with my counters and you guys kind of know, like, a little bit about me, this is kind of like, this is kind of how I want to go. I want to just go over, like, other people's stories and we'll talk about it. And we'll basically just go over and be like, what would make this person do this? Or why would you think that? Just kind of things like that. Like, it just sounds fun to do those kinds of things. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. All right. But other than that, so we got the sign out the way, all these plants, if you guys didn't know. So my wife is really big into plants. It's like a rainforest around our house. Like we always have all these different types of plants and waterings and all this. Like everybody's on a schedule with these plants and everything like that. And it's always crazy. It's always so fun. But she's really into plants, which is cool and stuff like that. So I always got these plants around me and stuff like that. Like one of them, this is like, no, this one is like a money tree and stuff like that. So I mean, it ain't bringing in no money, so I don't know what we're doing with that. But it's pretty cool. Like she has this, she kind of has this thing that she likes to do, and a little hobby and stuff. So she just kind of just has plants all around the house, which is fun. It's really nice. She's been really big as far as the supporting of this whole, this me doing this channel and wanting to do this. If you'd asked me last year, like streaming was what I wanted to do and play video games, but it was just so much of a not a burden, but it was more or less like there was so much into it. Like this whole setup, like I'd say it wasn't cheap, but it's a lot easier to manage. Like you can see these things and you can kind of change some things, so like adjust volumes and stuff. The video is about as good as this is gonna get, because now that I upgraded the camera from the old webcam and stuff like that, like we're hoping like, it's just fun, and it's just something nice to do. Like I enjoy it and stuff like that, and it's not too much to set it up. And you're talking about like real life events and stuff like that. It's not just sitting in front of a camera and getting pissed off because you're playing a video game, things like that. So this has been, it's been very fun for me. So I like it. I've enjoyed the first 4 episodes that I've done, and we'll just kind of see where it goes from there. All right. So the first we'll go over. So the first kind of half of this is what I want to talk about. Is basically the first thing I want to talk about is the origin of the Bigfoot name. So, and a lot of people don't know about this stuff, and you hear about Bigfoot and you hear about all these scenarios and different topics and stuff like that. So I'm gonna read off some of these different things that I was just, and this is all just stuff you can go on like Wikipedia and stuff like that and find. It's not like I'm, unearthing new evidence or something like that. And I'm by no means an expert at any of this, but it's just, it's nice to hear different encounters in different areas and in different time zones. It's really nice to kind of go over those things, which makes it a lot fun. It's like makes it a lot more fun because then you hear like people's different scenarios on how they were, how they reacted, or their take on the story of this whole thing. So the first part we'll go over kind of like Bigfoot, and then we'll kind of go into President Teddy Roosevelt's story, which he wrote a book about. And then we will kind of go into like the first recorded ever like alien abduction. And all these stories are pretty crazy. Like, I mean, if you're if you're coming into this thinking like everything is going to be action packed and all this stuff, like these are the kind of stories that kind of set up these kind of scenarios and these kind of stories. So these are like, I spent like probably like a couple hours reading all these, and they were pretty crazy. Some of them were, but some of them get mundane and kind of like the same kind of Bigfoot or alien stories you kind of hear. So we'll just kind of, we'll kind of go through it and see what we can get out of it. So we'll basically read through all of these, and all of these, I mean by like two different encounters. So one is an encounter from these guys who were in the frontier back in like the 1830s and stuff like that, and all the way up to 1958 and 2002, and all these different kind of people who talked about these different things, and we're going over all these things and just kind of, just kind of see what their take was back. And you can see kind of the transition from like when you first encounter it and you first heard about it to where you are today, and see like, oh my God, like this, like it's so weird over the years how all of this is kind of like, transferred and changed into something else. Like it's all pretty much similar to being the same Bigfoot and, kind of cryptid encounters, but a lot of the stories, they have their little nuggets that are a little bit different, and it just kind of makes everything, it makes it very interesting, and it always leaves you with like a what if, like, oh well, what if this or what if that, and it's very interesting, that's for sure. All right, so the origin of the Bigfoot name. So in 1958, Jerry Crew, a logging company bulldozer operator, discovered a set of large 16-inch human-like footprints sunk deep within the mud in the Six Rivers National Forest. Upon informing his coworkers, may have claimed to see similar tracks to the previous job sites as well, telling old incidents such as oil drums, like weighing like 450 pounds, had been moved without explanation, which I don't know if you've, like we deal with like 55-gallon drums, and those things are not light. So to see somebody move something like that, or it just not have an explanation of why they moved, because most time you need like a forklift unless you're like rolling and stuff like that. But yeah, upon that, so he moved. So the drums were basically moved without explanation. The logging company soon began utilizing the term Bigfoot to describe this mysterious culprit. Crews who initially believed someone was playing a prank on them once again observed more of these numerous footprints and contacted reporter. So all this stuff, I didn't even know. First off, in 1950, I didn't even know they had bulldozers, to be honest. Like, I didn't think that came around to like the 80s or like 70s or something like that. But that's just my opinion. Um, but they made like these plaster casts, which were made of the footprints, and crew appeared holding. And in the picture, you can see the crew appeared holding one of the casts on the front page of the newspaper on October 6, 1958. The story spread rapidly as Genzoli began to receive his correspondence for the major media outcome in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times. As a result, the term Bigfoot became widespread as a reference to an apparently large unknown creature, massive footprints in the northern California area. And then there was this whole bunch of, like, after that, kind of like in 1958, that whole scenario where, which is kind of weird because, and I'm going to be all over the place with this whole story and stuff like that and go back and forth, but it's just, it's just my thought process. So if you don't like it, I mean, obviously you don't know me, but for the majority of it, this is kind of how my brain goes one way and then it goes another. But it's weird how in 1958 that all of these occurrences started happening, but it's about the same time frame. So the 1960s, the 1970s was also when aliens and all that stuff started happening too. That's when you first started seeing all these abductions and all these sightings and everything like that. So it's very weird how some of these things went about and how they came about, as far as the age and the time frame when technology was starting to get advanced, and it's just weird timing for me. But so after that, so there was this big, huge thing where saying like in 2009, the family of Crew, who was Jerry Crew, was the one who was in charge of the logging company. Deceased co-worker by Ray Wallace stated that his father had been secretly making the large footprints with carved wood, and that they were responsible for the tracks. Despite the Wallace family statements, Willow Creek and Humboldt County are considered by some to be the Bigfoot capital of the world. So even like that's 1958 to 2002. That's at least, that's almost 45, at least 45 years right there. So the difference in the stories from how it started, how these guys were at a logging company up in Humboldt County in California, and they were basically seeing these things, and they might have been seeing them. I don't know. They might not have been seeing them, but it's just weird how you have this bunch of group of men who are seeing these different things, and there's only one guy who's basically responsible for this. And I just don't see that happening because, I mean, if you've been at work and stuff like that, it's really odd for, if it's like 4 or 5 group of friends and stuff like that, or a group of coworkers, you're basically like, once you guys clock out, you guys leave together. It's not like, Bill's staying behind and he's like, "No, guys, I'm just gonna stay and just hang out in the woods." Like, you'd be like, "What the fuck?" So it's not like it would just be very odd to see somebody, and in these areas up in the forests and stuff like that, it's not like, there's not 500 houses around. There's not like your next door neighbor is 100 feet away. It's very hard to go unnoticed in these kind of areas. Like, if you see a vehicle out there, that somebody's in the area or doing something. It's not like, I mean, especially in like a logging area where you're working and stuff like that. And I'm assuming probably these things, you're running 24 hours and stuff like that, which is not going to be, you can't really hide that stuff. Like, "Hey man, what's Bill still doing here at 10 p.m.? Like, you'd be like, "What the fuck are you doing here, dude?" "Oh, I'm just making Bigfoot casting." So it's just very hard to believe that after 45, 50 years that this is still like it's a hoax up to this point and stuff. So it was just very odd for me when I read this at first. And then they had this statement from the newsletter. It said, "At Bald Rock, 60 miles from Fresno, John Rose killed a grizzly bear which for nearly 12 years was called Bigfoot. By miners in the vicinity, it is estimated that he killed 1,000 sheep in his time and has many fights with Chinese sheep herders. He carried scars to show it, for when he was cut open, several bullets were found in his carcass that had been fired into him in the past years. He was killed in the canyon and could not get out. Or wait, no, what? He was killed in a canyon and could not got out, but those who saw him estimated weight 2,000 pounds. His hide was as good load for two men to carry out of San Francisco Chronicle. So I mean, they're obviously their literature's not really that good. But in 1895, the article describing a giant grizzly bear named Bigfoot. So then everybody associates that with like, hey, this has got to be the Bigfoot they're talking about. Like maybe, I don't know. At that point, I feel like you're trying to find an answer. You know what I mean? So if you see, if you see something, if you see a ghost, or if you believe you see a ghost, I guess, or if you see an alien, or a Bigfoot, or a Mothman, or a Loch Ness monster, or fucking little pygmy guys. I don't know what it is. If you see something like this, there's always that initial urge or that need to want to. You need an answer, like if and that's in everyday life. If something seems off to you or something is wrong to you, then it probably is. There's no way you can just rationalize and be like, no, I'm cool with that. That was okay. Like, no, most people are going to be like, hey, what was that? I need some sort of explanation to see or to feel like, hey, like I need, for me to sleep better at night, I need to know what I saw versus what I think I saw. Because your mind plays tricks on you. It's really weird. It's not like you can just, just go off and be like, oh man, yeah, like this is okay. Like, no, if you see something that is odd, most people at that point in time will question it and be like, hey, like this was wrong, or this is weird, or this is off, and I'm going to bring it up. But back in these times, like 1950s, up to probably like the 80s or the 90s, no one talked about these things or no one dealt with these things because it was very weird to see these things or talk about these things. It was just not something that people did. And it made a lot of people, like, I wonder all the time is how many people died and went to their deathbed knowing certain things in this world that they had never talked about. As far as, if they saw a ghost or if they saw a Bigfoot or if they saw aliens, something like that. Like, there's always, like, people who have been through these and seen these things. Like, a lot of these times you didn't bring them up. You didn't talk about them. You just buried that shit deep, and that was kind of the end of it. And that's kind of that male role as far as, like, you don't want to bring up and stir the pot with certain things, or you don't want somebody to see you differently because of the fact, like, you go to church or you're in a church and stuff like that. Like, it's just not, like, back in that time frame, like, everybody went to church. You went to church on Sundays, and if you bring up weird stuff like that at these time frames, people just looked at you like you were stupid, and no one took you seriously. You were known as like the weirdo, or the person who just spouts off like dumb things and shit like that. Like, it was just very weird to grow up in like the time frame, like seeing my dad and then my grandpa on his side, like just how much like you tried to keep everything in house. Like, you never tried to like bring up issues and stuff. It was just very weird to see those kinds of things. So I can see why, like, a lot of these people at the time in 1950s, 1960s just didn't want to talk about these things. And you can tell because it was not acceptable at that time. So no one really brought it up. So there's also another article. So before this, in the 1830s, Wyandotte chief nicknamed Bigfoot due to his significant size, strength, and large feet. Chief Momkasuk, known as Chief Bigfoot, is today's synonyms with the area of Wisconsin and his state park schools named after him. In the 19th century, was nicknamed Bigfoot due to his large feet, and today has a town named after him. If you didn't know, it's in Texas. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, at least two enormous marauding grizzly bears were widely noted in the press, and each nicknamed Bigfoot. The first grizzly bear called Bigfoot was reportedly killed near Fresno, California in 1895. After killing sheep for years, his weight estimated 2,000 pounds. The second one was active in Idaho in the 1890s and 1900s between the Snake and Salmon rivers, and their supernatural powers were attributed to it. So, one of the first widely published accounts of what could be considered a Bigfoot encounter was actually, like, the actual documented one was actually written by none other than President Theodore Roosevelt in 1892. The Wilderness Hunter was the name of this book. And Roosevelt was an avid frontiersman and hunter and traversed the wild American forests and stuff like that. And in his travels, Roosevelt was told of two trappers who had a deadly encounter with an unknown beast, which left enormous human footprints in its wake. In the wild 19th century alpine terrain of the Bitterrot Mountains along the Idaho and Montana border reported Bigfoot sightings still originate from this wilderness area. And one of the trappers was allegedly killed by this beast, and his survivors and partner named Bauman had become an old man when he shared his frightening story with the future president. The German-born Bauman spent most of his life in the frontier west, and his story was so impressed by Roosevelt, a man not easily taken by tall tales, and he included in this book that the wilderness hunter, and thus perpetuating the legendary encounter for another 100 years. So, I mean, obviously that has to have some sort of like, it's got to have some sort of weight to it. Like why would, like at that time frame, if you're like, obviously this is probably before he was President Roosevelt, then, because I think if you're a president and you bring up this kind of shit, like you would have to be the president and then bring it up. Like you couldn't bring this up and then become the president, because I feel like the U.S. would be like, no, we're not having this guy. So so yeah, so one of the first widely published accounts was this, and he actually wrote in this eloquent excerpt. Roosevelt retells Bauman's story. So obviously it was big enough for Teddy Roosevelt to actually write like a story of like, hey, this is kind of what happened, and this is kind of how it went. So frontiersmen are not, as a rule, apt to very superstitious. They lead lives to a hard and practical, and have too little imagination and think spiritual and supernatural. I have heard but few ghost stories while living on the frontier, and those were of perfectly commonplace and conventional type. But I once listened to a goblin story which I was rather impressed me. And this is Teddy Roosevelt telling his side of. So Bauman had never, if he told people, there was not enough people that it got like headlines or storylines for about this. So he told Roosevelt this, and he kind of put it in his book and stuff like that, which makes it, Roosevelt did a wonderful job. And I forget the guy who published this, but I think I'll get to it at the end. But I just looked up this, and this all just came from like Google searching. I was like, when was the first Bigfoot encounter or story? And this is the first thing that popped up. And it was very interesting to see how many people had different takes on how this whole entire situation went down. So it was very cool. So a grizzly, weather-beaten old mountain hunter named Bauman, who was born and had passed all of his life on the frontier, told this story to me. He must have believed what he said, for he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points of the tale. But he was of German ancestry, and childhood had doubtless been saturated with all kinds of ghost and goblin lore. So that many fearsome superstitions were latent in his mind. Besides, he knew well the stories told by Indian medicine men in the winter camps of the snow walkers and the specters, spirits, ghosts, and apparitions, the formless evils, beings that haunt the forest depths, and dog and waylay and lonely wander as nightfall passes through the regions where they lurk. It may not be when they overcome their horror of their fate to befell his friend. And when oppressed by awful dread of the unknown, he grew to attribute both all the time and still more in remembrance weird and elfin traits to was merely so abnormally wicked and cunning wild beasts, but whether this was so or not, no man could say. And like his depiction of this whole thing was like insane. I was like, oh my god, like he really sets up the scene for everything, and he really kind of, he makes you like, oh my god, like yeah, like I feel like I'm there. So that's what I'm trying to do with you guys. Like I don't, I literally saw this a couple days ago, and I was just like, hey, what am I going to talk about on my podcast? And this is what kind of led me to it. And I'm like, hey, this sounds like a good story or a topic to talk about. So I'm like, yeah, let's talk about it. So when the event occurred, Bauman was still a young man and was trapping with his partner among the mountains dividing the forks of the Salmon from the head of the Wisdom River. So the Salmon and Wisdom River was also where they had those two encounters with the grizzly bears, so it wasn't like, so this is weird how this is like almost like 20 years before, and kind of the same encounters are happening, obviously, in the 1950s as well. So it was just really weird to see that. And I was like, oh, wow, that puts two and two together. Not having had much luck, and his partner determined to go up a particularly wild and lonely pass through which he ran a small stream that had many beavers in it. The memory of this event, however, weighted very lightly with two trappers, who were as adventurous and hardy as the other kind. They took to their lean mountain ponies and foot a pass with the left in the beaver meadow. The rocky timber clad ground became their own impractical. What the fuck is that word? Onward impractical for horses. They then struck out on foot into these vast gloomy forests. Um, while Bowman was making ready for supper, it began to get dark. His companion began to examine the tracks that he came across, and soon took a brand to the fire to follow them up. So basically, a brand is basically took like a torch. So basically, they get to this point where they're trying to look for these beaver pelts and stuff like that, and they want to basically they're trying to go up this impasse where a lot of people don't go, and they just want, obviously they're trying to make, either they're trying to get food or they're trying to make money and stuff like that. So obviously people are going there, but nobody's ever went this far. We wanted to go this time, so they wanted to go up there, and it was basically an area where nobody had hardly been. And once they get up there, they start making a fire and stuff like that. They got the horses bedded down. They're trying to, rest for the night and stuff. And they stumble upon these footprints that are in the ground. And it's not, they're not normal footprints. They're pretty big and pretty massive footprints. Though, but they don't think anything of it, because obviously these guys are probably as tough as it comes, and they don't want to, they don't give a shit. They're like, like whatever. Like, we're here for beaver pelts. I don't care who's walking in the mud up here. So that's what they go about. Where the intruder had walked along, a game trail after leaving the camp. When the brand flickered out, he returned and took another one, repeating his inspection of the footprints very closely. Coming back to the fire, he stood by it a minute or two, peering out into the darkness. And just like I said before, I'm like, if you're in the dark, man, and some things are dark, I'm talking like the black dark. Like, you never want to shine anything towards that. Like, it's the creepiest and scariest thing. If you don't think the night is creepy, and you live in a town and stuff like that, and you live in city and there's lights and everything, like that's cool. But you go out to the country and you see this kind of, these kind of lights and stuff like that are just like, your light is the only light out there. That's the creepiest shit ever. So you can just imagine these two guys. There's no there's no telephone poles with lights on them. It's just literally this guy's going out there with a stick with an ember on it to look at these footprints. And once you get to a certain point in that, man, your mind is like your worst enemy. Because I don't give a shit if you're religious, if you believe in these things, or if you think any of these things. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, your mind is going to make up whatever the hell it wants to make up. So we don't know, you know what I mean? So I couldn't tell you here or there whether or not this is true or whether it's not. But I'm just saying, in modern times, this is normal for people to get in these kind of scenarios where you're just like, no, this shit ain't right, and this shit's kind of weird. So the memory of the event weighted very lightly with the two trappers, where they're adventurous and hardy for others' kind. They took their lead mountain ponies to the foot of the path. Oh, we already read that shit. Coming back to the fire, he stood a minute or two. There you go, right there. Now we're back at it. So Bauman laughed at this, but his partner insisted that he was right. And upon again examining the tracks with the torch, they certainly didn't seem to be made up by 2 paws or 2 feet. However, it was too dark to make sure. After discussing whether the footprints could possibly be those of blankets, and went to sleep. Wait, no. Those of a human. Oh, they thought that they came to the conclusion that they were human footprints, and concluding that, they all went to sleep and turned over. At midnight, Bauman was awakened by some noise and sat up in his blankets. As he did so, his nostrils were struck by this wild beast odor, and he caught loom of a great body in the darkness at the mouth of the lane. Grasping his rifle, he heard the smashing under woods as the thing, whatever it was, rushed off in the impenetrable blackness of the forest and night. So after the 2 men slept but little, sitting up with the rekindled fire, because obviously once that shit happens, you're going to want to make a fire. Like, you're not just going to be like, oh no, let's just sit in the dark. Like, no, you're going to fucking make a big ass fire. I'm making a 20-foot fire so I can see 500 feet away from me. But yeah. In the morning, they started out to look at the few traps that they had So basically, these guys, after that, they hear nothing and they think nothing of it. Like most people in this scenario, like I mean, you've seen enough movies at this point where you're like, hell no, man, it's time to get the hell out of there. You ain't trying to, I'm not trying to deal with that shit. Um, so basically, they were like, all right, whatever, nothing happened to us, we're good. In the morning, they started out to look at the few traps they had set previously evening and put out by new ones, and they put out new ones. By any unspoken agreement, they kept together all day. Returned to camp towards evening. On nearing it, they saw hardly the astonishment that Lean had been torn down. So basically, their camp. So they're out setting up fucking traps, and their camp is torn down, which is already like, nah, I'm at it. The visitor of the preceding day had returned, and in wanton malice had tossed around their camp and bedding and destroyed their shanty. The ground was marked up by tracks on leaving, and it had come and gone. The footprints were as plain as it on the snow, as carefully scrutiny of the trail. It certainly did seem like whatever the thing was had walked up, but on two legs. The men, thoroughly uneasy, gathered a great heap of dead logs and kept up the roaring fire throughout the night, one of them sitting on guard most of the night. About midnight, the thing came down through the forest opposite across the brook and stayed on the hillside nearly an hour. They could hear the branches crackle as it moved, and several times it. Wait, what the fuck? About midnight, the thing. Yeah. Several times it uttered a harsh, granting, long-drawn moan, peculiarly sinister sound. Yet it did not venture near the fire. In the morning, the two trappers, after discussing the strange events of the last night, they decided they would not shoulder the packs and leave the valley that afternoon. They were more ready to do so because, in spite of seeing a good deal of game signs, they caught very little fur. However, it was necessary first to get along those traps and gather them. They then started out to do that. All morning they kept together, picking up trap after trap, each one of them. How many fucking traps do they got? Like at that point, dude, just leave the traps, bro. The traps are like, you can make more of those. Why would you stay in this kind of scenario if you know something is there stalking you, there doing these things? On first leaving the camp, they had the disagreeable sensation of being followed. So you ever that feeling? Like little hairs on the back of your neck will tell you, like, dude, your intuition will tell you most of this shit. In the dense spruce thickets, they occasionally heard a branch snap as they passed, and now and then they were slightly rustling noises among the small pines to the side of them. Man, there's a lot of white flags in this whole story. A lot of white flags in this whole scenario. Like, I don't get why people just don't. How people do these things nowadays. It's just mind-boggling to me. So at noon, they were back within a couple miles of the camp. In the high, bright sun, the fear seemed absurd to the two men because obviously you could see. Accustomed as their thorough long years of lonely wandering in the wilderness, they faced every kind of danger from man, brute, and element. There were still 3 beaver traps to collect from a little pond and a wide raven nearby. So Bauman volunteered to gather them and bring them in. See, that was their first mistake. Like, if you guys have been together up to this point, like together, why would you say, hey, for the last 3, why would you want to go get them by yourself? That's my first thing, you know what I mean? Like, it's the same thing like on a combat deployment. Everyone dies in the first month and the last month. Why? Because you get complacent. And complacency kills. Like, unfortunately, it does. So when you're complacent in the beginning and in the end is when the most people die. That's just my take on it. On reaching the pond, Bauman found 3 beavers in the traps, one of which had pulled loose and carried into the beaver house. He took several hours, not 30 minutes, not 10 minutes, not 50 minutes, 30. He took several hours. Motherfucker, how long is several hours? Several hours could be. If I'm talking several, I'm talking like that's a whole work day, bro. Like, if it's up to me, like, I'm going back to get help. I'm not spending 7 hours or several hours. I'm not spending more than an hour by myself at that point. If you've already seen and done everything, like something's stalking you, something's waking you up, something rummaged your damn camp, like, why would you think that's okay? Like, I don't care if it's daylight or not. That's just my take. He took several hours in securing and preparing the beaver. And when he started homewards, he marked with some uneasiness how low the sun was getting. As he hurried toward camp under all the trees, the silence and desolation of the forest waited on him. His feet made no sound in the pine needles, and the slanting sun rays striking him through the straight trunks made a gray twilight in which objects at distance glimmered indistinctly. There was nothing to break the gloomy stillness, which was there no breeze, always broads over the somber, primeval forest. At last he came to the edge of the glide where the camp lay and shouted as he approached, but got no answer. Yeah, because you've been gone for several hours, bro. Like, what do you think was going to happen? There's something stalking you out there, and both you separate for several hours. I can see separating for 30 seconds to go take a piss, but not several hours, bro. What did you think was going to happen? The campfire had gone out, though the thin blue smoke was still curling up. Near it lay packs wrapped and arranged. At first, Bauman could see nobody, nor did he receive the answer call. Stepping forward again, he shouted. As he did, he fell on the body of his friend, stretched beside the trunks of great fallen spruce. Rushing towards it, horrified, Trapper found that the body was still warm, but the neck was broken. While there were 4 great fang marks in the throat, footprints of the unknown beast creature printed deep in the soft soil told the whole story. The unfortunate man, having finished his packing, had sat down on the spruce log with his face to the fire and his back to the dense woods to wait for his companion. While thus waiting, his monstrous assailant, which must have been lurking in the woods, waiting for his chance to catch one of the adventurers, unprepared, came silently up from behind, walking with long, noiseless steps and singing still on 2 legs. Evidently unheard, it reached the man and broke his neck by wrenching his head backwards with its forepaws, while it buried its teeth in his throat. It had not eaten the body, but apparently had romped and gambled around it the uncouth. Whatever that means, it doesn't sound good regardless. Ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over and over it, and had them fled back in the Southland deep woods. What the fuck? Like, why would, like, what did you think was going to happen, dude? So you leave. So basically, the scenario that I'm getting out of this is there's 3 more beaver traps you have to go take care of. And you're like, hey, my bad, bro. I'm just going to go take care of these on my own. You can just go ahead and set up camp, eat, relax, still a little bit of daylight, so you don't think anything's going to come. Or if it does, you can at least see it. So this dude is gone, Bauman, who's kind of he's just kind of like, it just wasn't smart what he did. Like proper decisions would save so many lives if people did them in the moment. But because people think of like, nothing's ever going to happen to them, they just think it's like, okay, and this is like fine, which it's not. Like, this dude left, which was only supposed to take him probably 30 minutes or 40 minutes. It takes him several hours to do this stuff. He takes several hours, comes back, and he hears himself walking. He hears himself walking on the pine needles. And as you're walking on the pine needles, you can be like, walking on the pine needles, and he doesn't hear a sound. And when he approaches the camp, which has pine needles all around it, he finds his friend's dead body pointing towards the fire, where his neck had been ripped back and where he'd bit the shit out of him 4 times and killed him. Like, this is just, like, I just don't get how you get into this kind of situation when you're more worried about the beaver pelts than you are, like, your safety. Like, that's what I don't get in this whole entire scenario. But that's just me. Like, and I don't even know what that would be like to come up, especially around this time frame. Like, there's not, in this time frame, there's no cell phones, and that's probably the worst of it, man. There's no cell phones to be like, hey, like we are being fucked up, we need your help, like ambulance, police, somebody come, forest ranger, I don't care. At this time frame, it's just you two, and that's your only companion. Like, the worst thing you could ever think of is if you're in this kind of scenario and you look on the ground and your only friend, the only person you've been talking to for the last year, 2 years, or however long you've been out there, is dead now. Because some creature who you guys saw the footprints, like, your buddy is seeing these footprints. He's seeing this creature. He's saying, hey, something's off with this and stuff like that. It's just not, Like, to be put in this scenario is very tough because for Bauman's sake, like, to live with that for the rest of his life is really shitty. If this indeed actually did happen. For Bauman, is, you could go two ways with it. You could be like, hey, like, this is just a scenario or a story that he cooked up to get over the excuse that he killed his friend, or maybe it was Indians that they ran upon, and they got into the mix with them, and then one or two of them just hunted him down, and this dude gets killed and gets fucking stabbed. I don't know. Or in all reality, the way everything is it was a Bigfoot, and this motherfucker was stalking you. First off, you were in an area that nobody went to or nobody wanted to go to because it was too far up north. It was the pass. You had to leave your horses and you had to walk the rest of the way. And then by the time you get up there, you're like, hey, like, this is, you start seeing footprints, you start getting stalked by this weird creature. It's just nothing good comes out of this scenario. And just to see this kind of, to hear these kinds of things and stuff like that, it was really, really crazy to hear. It was really crazy to hear. So to read that stuff, so that was the first time I had read it all the way through. So in the end, like, I skimmed through it and stuff like that, but I knew that his buddy had died, but I didn't know how his buddy died. So to hear that that's how his buddy died, like, this motherfucker's head was ripped back, and he was like bit, like he was a vampire. Like, that shit's crazy. Like, that's unheard of to hear those kinds of things. It was very, very odd to hear those kinds of things, but it was, shit happens, man. It really does. But yeah, that was a crazy ass story. Once I heard that, I was like, oh my god, like, I have to talk about that one. That one's pretty good, not gonna lie. And that one was by so that story, I got that story from Ted Bonnet. And Ted Bonnet was just like this dude who just wrote, he just rewrote all these claims and stuff that everybody had talked about and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool to hear that. Thanks, Ted. Appreciate it, bro. Appreciate you. All right, so that's the first. So from there, what the hell is in my drink? It's like little bugs or something, dude. Like aliens. There's like little aliens in here, and they're just like gonna eat my brain. I'm just kidding. It's probably dirt. Let's be honest. It's probably dirt. So that was the first Bigfoot. So at least that's what, as far as researching it on the internet, because 100 things could be different or wrong. That's basically the first major Bigfoot story, which was written. So that whole like story and everything was written by Teddy Roosevelt, which is in his book that he wrote called The Wilderness Hunter. I've never read it. Maybe I'll read it. Probably not. I don't know. Maybe. But it just seems like that whole era and that time frame was just a weird time, man. That was just a weird time. Like, I couldn't imagine being in those kind of scenarios or being in that area of this, where you're just coming to a new area and all that stuff, and it's just there's no cell phones or anything like that. It's just literally you in the woods, man. And there could be all kinds of weirdos and all these different things out there. So it was very, very weird for me as far as that. So after that one, so that was the first. So the first thing I was like, hey, like, what? I wonder what the bare first time, at least documented. When was the first time Bigfoot or something, or somebody had talked about it? And that was the first one that came up. So then I said, well, I wonder what the first reported alien abduction was. And boy, was that one just as wild as the rest of them. I was like, oh my God, this is crazy too. So Grant Piper wrote this story. And well, he didn't write the story. He wrote the story that I'm going to read. But he's just basically going off of somebody else's story for the first abduction that happened, which was pretty crazy. So the first reported alien abduction, the Hill incident, is a bizarre mix of flying saucers, little gray men, hypnosis, and hysteria. The story is now a familiar one. A flying saucer blinking and moving erratically descends from the sky and abducts unsuspecting people or animals. These incidents usually occur in remote and rural places. The people are taken aboard the craft, poked, prodded, and examined before being put back on the ground. This kind of story has become a paradigm, whatever that is, in the UFO community. But like everything in life, there was a first. In 1961, Betty and Barney Hill claimed to have been abducted by extraterrestrials in rural New Hampshire. New Hampshire, not even New Mexico, not near Area 51, not like New Hampshire. What the fuck goes on in New Hampshire? Like, what the hell? Their account will set off a frenzy of UFO interest and paranoia and launch the United States in the modern UFO age, which this happened in, what? 1961. Oh, that's weird. Jerry's crew, the logging company, saw Bigfoot in 1951. 3-year difference, people. Coincidence? Think not. Maybe. Might be a coincidence. Their claim is strange and vivid and comes together with the help of the hypnotist. The story itself details subsequent attention which will shape and color UFO sightings and experience for decades to come. Who were the Hills? Betty and Barney Hill were a married couple living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They were active in their local church and members of the NAACP. They were considered leaders of civil rights and were fairly known locally. Barney was an African-American man, making them an interracial couple at the time, which was such a frowned upon. At the time of the incident in 1970, Barney was 39 years old and Betty was 42 up until the incident. There were no reports of anything being out of the ordinary with the Hills. So, first thing it puts up is ba-boom. Big old UFO just sitting there, buddy. What you think about that? You think it's fake? You think it's a scam? It might be, maybe. It looks pretty pixelated. I can make that with like some paint, maybe. I don't know, probably. So Simon did sessions with the Hills for 6 months in which he was accrued more and more allegedly suppressed details about the incident. Buzzing sounds, watches that no longer worked, a roadblock, a fiery orb on the road. The details kept coming. And by the end of it, the initial report of the strange sightings of the craft in the sky around White Mountains of New Hampshire had evolved into this tale of terror and hysteria. The final tale comes out something like: the couples were driving through the mountains, saw strange lights, the lights grow and approach. This is the initial tale that was reported to the Air Force in 1961. Now in 1963, the details get fleshed out, which basically fleshed out means they go into more detail for the shit. So basically, the two were taken aboard the saucer by small gray men. They were separated and examined. Betty is shown kindness and spoken to at length by the alien leader. He shows her a specific map of the stars allegedly from the point of view of the home planet. He even jokes with her. He wants to give her a book to take back home with her, but the captain is voted down by his crew. They are eventually deposited back to their car where they are told they won't remember any of this. Simon even gets Betty to draw this map that the alien leader showed her, to which consisted of a bunch of points that she said were stars that lined going between them. A rendering of the map Betty allegedly drew under the hypnosis, Barney either before or after the abduction, isn't quite clear. Dries off in panic and encounters a roadblock with more people. Aliens or the government, maybe. Finally, on their way out of the mountains, they see a fiery orb, which they say looked like the moon, but the moon had set hours ago. They finally returned home, and after the ordeal and the claim, the drive through the mountains took hours longer than it should have, and the good portion of the feeling hazy and disjointed got all that good. So, anyway, that's a little fucking. So that is the constellation that she said she saw. So basically, it's just a depiction of all these different stars, and it kind of just shows them, like, hey, this is the route that they took, and this is where their home, which is basically Zeta 2 is where their home is, which was just very odd to see. In 1963, I'm sure it wasn't like as detailed with all as far as like names and stuff like that, but to have somebody detail it like that, it's pretty crazy. A perpetrated picture of the UFO in 1952. Interest in the UFO and fantastical technology has been growing steadily through the 1950s. This was due to the new era of technology, unsheared in by World War II. So there were new rockets, jet engine, nuclear bombs, television in the world that had become nothing the sort of a decade ago. Things had been moving at an exponential pace since the end of World War II. But up until this incident in 1961, there was no mainstream account of an alien abduction. In fact, the incident forges the term alien abduction as the alien abduction lays the groundwork for many copycat accounts to come. So that's the unfortunate part is you have these encounters in like 1950s and 1960s, and people want to make like copycats of it. So if somebody has an incident, they see all the publicity and they see how many people are like digging in this stuff, it's really hard um, to be like, hey, this is real. Like most people are going to be like, no, that shit's fake. Like you can't do that. So on the night of September 19th, 1961, the Hills were driving home from a vacation in Canada. While on US 3, Route 3, they were traveling the White Mountains of New Hampshire. So this is basically the entire story to its entirety. They appeared as shooting star moving upwards instead of downwards. Betty claims she saw a cluster of multicolored lights pass over the face of the moon. They began to drive slowly down a mountain pass called the Franconia Notch, and the lights kept moving with them. They're darting around the sky, following the bends, hovering over the hills. Eventually, the lights get closer and begin descending towards the couple's vehicle. The object grows close enough to be seen fully, causing Barney to stop the car and get out and look. He allegedly grabs his gun and his binoculars and set on them, getting a good look at the object. He describes a craft that appears to him as a pancake in the sky that has many dozens of feet in the length. Through the binoculars, he can see the craft features windows, and the windows identifies nearly a dozen humanoid creatures that he knows cannot be human. The craft moves until it's directly above them, and the car, at which point Barney Hill jumps back in and tries to drive away to escape the craft out of fear. Then the couple claims to have been blacked out and do not remember driving for over 30 miles before they came to farther down the mountain. So, initial report seems a little odd. You know what I mean? Like, how could you... I just don't get how you would think some of these things are like just made up and stuff like that. So Barney and Betty Hill do contact the authorities regarding their experience. However, their first report is a much milder retelling of what came later. So most of the times when you're in shock and you're in this kind of this trance in this state and stuff like that, like you don't want to recall or talk about any of these things. So obviously after the fact, like all of my experiences that I've had in combat, like the initial response in talking about these things is very, it's very normal and stuff like that. It's not, it's not in great detail and stuff. It's very, it's very simple. But as you get older and stuff like that, and you remember these things after the years, it becomes very easy to be like, hey, like this is everything that happened. You know what I mean? But give me 1 second, guys, real quick. Boom. Pause. Alrighty. Alright. Sorry about that, guys. My bad. I really did have to use the bathroom. My bad. Sorry. There's no like pause on this. So you just get like 30 seconds of just staring at my wall. But it's all good. Alright, so where were we? Alright, so the day after they returned from their trip, they phoned the local Air Force base to report their sighting. The full details of the report are not detailed, but they have said to have reportedly a brief little craft in the vicinity of the Franconia Notch. Their initial report must have been mild enough because they said they had probably been mistaken a particular bright instance of Jupiter that night as an alien craft, or even the lights atop the mountains as they drove through the pass. So, basically what I'm gathering out of that is no one believed them. Pretty much. Basically, everybody tries to play everything off like, hey, like, no, that's not what you saw. That couldn't be what you saw. So, and that's usually how it goes. Hmm? What the fuck? What do you mean? Okay, that makes sense. All right. Anyway, sorry, my bad. At this point, then they're about to enter like hypnosis. So like after this, they tell their stories and everybody, and as they're telling their stories, they basically get a little more information every time, which is very odd. Like, but I mean, it's not. It's probably odd for that time frame because you're like, why is there keep you guys keep adding more to the scenarios and the stories? So then basically they're like, hey, let's go under hypnosis. Like if you're under hypnosis, there's no way you can hide anything. Everything has to come out at that point. Over 2 years after the incident, the Hills claim they still are battling with anxiety, trauma, and memory loss surrounding the incident in the mountains. Speaking with some people from their church, they are put in touch with Benjamin Simon, a renowned hypnotist from Boston. In December of 1963, they see Simon and set up a series of hypnosis sessions in order to try and unlock the suppressed memories and lost time from the encounter in 1961. This is where things start to get weird. Under hypnosis, the two recount similar stories, the same stories that they've been telling up until this point, except now there's many vivid details. They started to spout out hypnosis. Leaders spoke to her in English, answered her questions, showed her a map, some books, and more. Barney claims he was poked, prodded, scraped, and thoroughly examined in his room. He says he was placed on a metal table that was too short for his larger body. Barney seems to over Barney seems overly concerned with large, hypnotic eyes that he claims were terrifying and mesmerizing. Betty is hung up on the objects that leaders showed while aboard. The hypnosis revealed a lot of emotional distress and trauma associated with the incident, and the details began to get more and more outlandish in their initial reports 2 years later. So basically, that's what I mean. That's the bad thing about it, though. Is your initial accounts like most of the times your terms and everything like that. Like once you have a traumatic event in your life, you're really like, your brain is like, no, you shouldn't see this. You shouldn't be going through this. So it suppresses a lot of those things until you get to a point in your life where your brain thinks it's okay to talk about these things and do these things. And there are always things that are going to be like, hey, like you haven't seen the full picture. And until you go through those events and talk about those events, like that's going to be the hard part. Because most people don't want to deal with it. So you suppress it and you bury that shit deep because you don't want to talk about it. You know what I mean? So this is the same thing going on with them. At some points, they were probably like, hey, like, we got to bring all this shit out and bring it to light. So basic conclusions of what probably happened. Benjamin Simon reports at the end of all their sessions that he believes that the Hills did encounter a traumatic incident in the mountains. He says that the Hills actually believed that they saw a craft with humanoid figures in it that night in the White Mountains, but did not believe that they were extraterrestrial event or that they were abducted. His official report claims that they had shared fantasies or a delusion that were probably brought on by Betty's strange and vivid dreams she was having at the time. He would later officially call the incident a psychological aberration. What? Like these guys are telling you and spilling everything that they have, and you're basically saying that they're like it's made up? Like why would at this point in time, like I get it nowadays, like you can make up whatever you want. You can talk about whatever you want. But at this point in time, why would someone make these things up? Because it just makes them look bad. Like no one's at this point, you're not looking for fame, you're not looking for publicity. It's more or less you just trying to like, hey, this is what happened. Like why won't anybody listen to me? And that's probably the hardest part about this is these people are like, hey, like let's talk about these things. And at the end of it, they're like, yeah, we're just gonna chalk it up as a psychological aberration. Yeah, no. And it's like, what? Like you guys, you brought them in for this. They brought you in for a specific reason, and you basically just threw it all away, which is kind of the irritating part. Which kind of makes sense, though, man. I mean, the people nowadays, if you bring up like Bigfoot or aliens or ghosts and stuff like that, most people are anti all of it. They don't want to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. Why? Because it's a conspiracy and everybody's like, why are you looking at me like that? Shit like that. You know what I mean? But Again, this is all my opinion. All I'm saying is I've seen the worst in men, the worst in men. And this is different countries, our own country. I've seen the worst in people. And I've also seen the very good in people and the very best. But what I'm saying is just because somebody's account is not what you think it should be, doesn't make it like it didn't happen. And I'm sure after this was published, this whole story and everything went out and went into the news and stuff like that, everybody else who had it happen to them or things like that, no one brought it up. No one talked about it. You want to know why? Because they didn't want to be put in that same category as these guys. Because at the end of it, you're basically, so psychological aberration. So let's look at the definition of it real quick. Let's just see. What does it mean? I don't know. But I guarantee it doesn't mean you're the smartest man in the world. Psychological. See, at some point I gotta just put this on my fucking computer. So I ain't gotta do this. Apparition. Web. What do we got? Let's see. Let's just see. Let's see what it is. Super. Oh my god, this is. I probably shouldn't have clicked on this. This is like. It's basically is an experience characterized by the apparent perception of either a living being or an inanimate object without there being any material stimulus for such a perception. The term ghost implies that some element of the human being survives, and that at least under certain circumstances can make itself perceptible to living beings. Jesus Christ. This is crazy. I don't even know that's what that meant. So basically all I'm getting out of that is basically you don't. It's from the definition of it is whatever you saw is something you're making up in your head. Is all I'm getting out of that. There's no rhyme or reason why you made it up. There's no rhyme or reason why it happened. It's just basically your brain is like, hey, this didn't happen. So here's what we do know. The Hills were driving late at night through the mountains after vacation of an unknown link to Niagara Falls in Montreal. There was an Air Force base in the area. There are lights in the nearby hills in the form of the restaurant. Radio towers and airplane beacons. The moon is out that night and Jupiter is also out, particularly bright. There are plenty of lights in the sky. What we don't know is how tired the couple are. How strenuous was their day? Why were they in the mountains so late? How wrapped up in the UFO craze were the Hills before the incident? So basically, you're trying to disprove what happened to them. It's not like they're saying like they didn't want any story or any fame off of this. They're just telling you their story of what they thought happened in their brain, and you guys basically threw them under the bus and was like, hey, like we're gonna disprove everything that you said. That's crazy. That's so crazy. This is the first time I'm reading this too, by the way. Like I haven't read through this all the way. So it's pretty crazy to hear their account and hear the people who tried to say that they were helping them. So after that, so yeah, I like to read the lesson. How wrapped up in the UFO craze were the Hills before this incident? What UFO craze? There wasn't any reported UFOs at this point. Well, at least none to like the public. So what do you mean? What kind of craze were they in? Like, what kind of craze are you talking about? So Betty claimed her sister saw a flying saucer in the years prior to the incident, and the first thing she did was go to the library and begin reading. Oh my God, this disclaims everything I just said. Could their minds have already been clouded with this bias before encountering a strange but natural phenomena. They probably did see something strange up in the mountains, whether it was a plane, a weather balloon, a strange combination of Jupiter, the moon, and the hilltop, or the lights, or something else. They were probably tired and scared and misinterpreted something mundane as something supernatural, and then filled in their experience together with the help of books, UFO researchers, and dreams. Many of the lurid details of the encounter did not come out until almost 3 years after the fact. Like, obviously, the people doing these interviews and doing this process have never had any traumatic event happen in their life to make them think this. And that's really sad to see at this point in time, in this year, in this decade that they were in, because no one, basically, they could have brought, at this point, they could have brought an alien to them, and they'd have been like, nah, that's not an alien, dude. You just cooked that up in your house. Like, what? All right. So many of the lurid details of this encounter did not come out until almost 3 years after the fact. They claimed they did not report the whole story to the Air Force the day after because they were feared for being labeled as eccentric. Bottom line is, the story changed in many ways years after the incident, and the information given closest to the event was such more tame than the later tellings. Their memory was probably colored by the injection of new information after the fact. A strange light in the mountain after a long day probably becomes aliens after strange dreams. Too much reading and the power of suggestion enter the picture. Either way, their retelling and vivid details that came out during their hypnosis session took the world by storm. Something did happen that night, and whatever it was, it scared them. That much we can say for certain. So that's it. Basically, you have the Bigfoot encounter that Theodore Roosevelt talks about around the same time frame. 3 years later, you have this huge incident that happens with an alien abduction. And basically, the hypnosis and all these theories, everybody just tries to disprove everybody's stuff, which is very, very, very sad. Unfortunately, obviously, these people are not with us anymore, but it would have been nice to see it now in today's 2022 to see what these people, their thought process and their theories about how all of this went on. Because I guarantee you it's nowhere near, they would have not gotten nearly as much scrupulation or disapproval from everybody in society now. Everybody's always talking about these things and doing these things and seeing aliens, all the accounts, all the Bigfoot encounters and everything like that. It's very hard to disprove these things when so many people are having these things go on. It's just very weird to hear both of these different scenarios that were around the same time frame, which is very weird. Now, let me see if I got my math right. So, yeah, in 1961, Betty and Barney Hill claimed to have been abducted by extraterrestrials. And then in 1958, Jerry Crew, a logging company bulldozer operator, discovered a set of 16-inch human-like footprints. What is going on here? Why is all this stuff happening, and why did it all come to light around the same time? That's the weird question. That's the question that no one wants to have an answer for, is why all of a sudden did all of these things come to light around the same time frame? Within 10 years, all this stuff started happening. It's just very weird. And it makes you wonder, before this time frame, if these things were happening before. They had to have been happening, but no one brought them up or no one talked about them, which is the very strange part for me. And to basically wrap up this whole entire podcast is, you have two different separate scenarios, one about Bigfoot and one about aliens. And they're supposedly the first Bigfoot encounter and the first alien encounter, and they're both around the same time frame, and they're both so weirdly far apart that it would be weird how all of this stuff starts happening. And it's all different. It's very weird. So to end this, I will say, if you do have an encounter, or if you do have some sort of scenario that goes on in your life and you're fueling it by something you've went through in your life, whether it be a traumatic event in your life, don't fuel the fire by trying to do research and do all these things. So with me and my Bigfoot encounter, I never had any of this information. This is all just stuff that I just researched within the last week. And to see how everyone is taking all of this Bigfoot and alien stuff from where it's been to where it came to now is just very different, and it's very weird. So it's nice to see people's different interactions and different retells of the story, to hear these types of things. But it's very cool to see it all, and to see how everything has come from this point in the 1960s to where we are now. So almost 60 years later, to see that this stuff is still being talked about today, and people are still bringing it up today, which is really nice, because it's not going to go away. If anything, people are just going to get more information, and they're going to talk about it more, and all these things are going to come out, and it's very nice to hear those things and to go through those things. It's pretty cool. So yeah, that's pretty much today's episode. I would like to hear what you guys think about this one. It's kind of like not a personal encounter, but it's more just stuff that I kind of pulled up on the internet, whether it be Wikipedia and stuff like that. So, and I tried to mention the guys who wrote the stories. They're pretty good guys. I mean, I read up on some of these guys to see their, like, how many other things that they have brought up and talked about and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool to hear these guys. The biggest one for me is probably Grant Piper. I mean, he's a pretty cool guy. I mean, most of his stuff is really, he doesn't have a lot of followers, and he's not really talking to a lot of people, but he really brings up some great stuff and some great points as far as these recollections and these alien abductions. It's pretty crazy. The one guy that we didn't get into is a guy named Richard Doty. So basically, he was a counterintelligence officer in Area 51. So basically, we will save that one, and I will tell his whole story and everything like that of what he kind of went through as far as like a counterintelligence officer in Area 51 around this time frame. So we'll save that one for another episode. But other than that, I hope you guys like this one. I appreciate everybody coming in, watching, tuning. I hope the camera view is a lot better, and I hope the audio's pretty good. But other than that, guys, I will catch you in the next episode of Combat Cryptids. You motherfuckers have a good and great weekend, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.